time to wrap up this look at dinosaur physiology. So that will be the subject of today's lecture. The lights down. There we go. Okay. So towards the end of last lecture, we were beginning to look at how dinosaurs seem to have solved a particular problem, and it's some that all the big dinosaurs would face as a consequence of physics, and that is as you get larger body size, your relative surface area to volume ratio goes down, and so you wind up trapping heat in your body. And in the early days of the study of dinosaur physiology, people said, great, that's how dinosaurs could maybe maintain stable heat, is they've got what was called gigantothermy, the fact that their large body size means that they trap heat, means they'll have stable temperature, even if they don't need necessary metabolic cellular regulation of that. But as this century came along, people said, no, wait, actually trapping heat is a problem for a big animal. It's not an advantage. That you run the risk, if you're very active, of cooking your brain or otherwise doing metabolically nasty things to vital organs. And so there's been a lot of research in recent years looking at mechanisms that large-bodied dinosaurs may have used to be able to dump heat. So last time I showed some aspects of radiative cooling in the form of things like fins and sails, which intriguingly tend to show up most often in dinosaurs in the warmest part of dinosaur history, that's the mid-Cretaceous, and tend to be concentrated towards the equatorial regions, the hottest times and hottest places the dinosaurs ever lived. And then we looked at some evaporative cooling structures, either respiratory turbinates or other nasal features where dinosaurs could use these internal structures in the nose to help dump heat as the air goes out and re-wet the air as it comes in to keep their lungs nice and moist. There's another attribute that may be involved in cooling, in this case radiative cooling, and it has to do with what's called the Frontoparietal Fossae. So here is a painting by Brian Eng, which is supposed to mimic a thermal and infrared image, but obviously it's a painting, and so you'll notice that in the crocodilians, in the Tyrannosaur, and in the bird, enantiornithine birds, they're all glowing, and parts of them are glowing more than others, so we can see the orbits, and also up here at the supratemporal fenestra. Notice, too, that the Chasmosaurian ceratopsid is not glowing because it is, in fact, dead. So it is room temperature. Now, what was glowing on the tops of the heads of the dinosaur, and for that matter, on the tops of the head of the big crocodilian, is the region that covers the supratemporal fenestra. And if you remember way back, look at your notes from way back, and the introduction of what is a dinosaur, one of the attributes they have is this forward expansion of a sort of a depressed area on the skull roof on top of the classic supratemporal fenestra. They're calling it dorsotemporal fenestra here, same thing. So there's this depression on the frontals and the parietals that extend forward. Modern crocodilians and their extinct relatives have this to some degree, and this seems to be convergent to what we see in dinosaurs. But it's an attribute that characterizes dinosaurian. Now, the classic interpretation is that this was an increase for the area for the jaw muscles, that the temporalis muscle is extending forward there. And there are some people who still advocate that. But what Holliday and his colleagues argued in this paper is that that's a less likely explanation. Among other things, this is a muscle that has to undergo a right-angle turn. And although that's not unheard of, you typically see that with some sort of lever or pivot structure that could go around, and we don't see that in the head. And their interpretation is that the muscles are simply filling what they're calling the dorsotemporal fossa here, that part of the supratemporal fenestra. And this thing on top of that extends forward to the frontoparietal fossa, was a region that was filled with vascular tissue and fat And then on top of that was the skin. And their argument for that is that we see that in crocodilians today. And we can see when we monitor crocodilians today that they radiate heat out of those spots. That's a spot in modern crocodilians where they're dumping some heat. So the argument here is that dinosaurs were doing the same thing. So it's yet another structure that they could have been used to help get heat out of the body. Now, when I introduced dinosaur anatomy way back when on osteology, I talked about the antorbital fenestra, and I said don't worry about the function of it yet. Now's the time to start worrying about the function, or speculate about it. So here's the antorbital fenestra. Technically speaking, though, that's the internal antorbital fenestra. And down here, remember, is the mandibular fenestra. And these two attributes are traits of archosaurs and their immediate kin. So the mandibular fenestra, of course, is a jaw muscle opening. But the antorbital fenestra is a space for it's a sinus. It's a space for an air sac. Now, in modern birds, this paranasal sinus, the one that occupies this spot, is actually actively ventilated. It's connected to the respiratory system. And so when birds breathe in and out, you can actually sometimes, if they're the right sort of bird, if you can see that part of the face, you can actually see the swelling expand and contract. As Porter and Whitmer have observed, and other people have as well, but they sort of summarized this in a paper that came out last year, there is a lot of skeletal evidence of vascularization of that region. So blood vessels flowing into and out of that region, and most especially in theropods. And the reason that's significant is theropods tend to have, they're the one group that tends to have a really big antorbital fenestra throughout most of their history. In ornithischians, it gets small. Sometimes it can even get reduced. In sauropodomorphs, it gets small. Theropods, they tend to keep a very large one. So here we see Majungasaurus, a bellisaurid, and they're tracing out the blood vessels going into and out of that region from the various bones that surround it. And so they argue that this is another spot for gas exchange. Maybe radiative cooling, maybe evaporative cooling, but some form of cooling, that the air is flowing into and out of that, and it's dumping heat from the blood vessels into there and getting it out of the body. And that the orbit as well actually may have that function. And indeed, lots of the large theropods, the small ones too, have a lot of complex sinuses in the skull. Some people had argued before that these were to reduce the mass of the skull so they could turn their heads around more quickly, and that may be a function as well. But the fact that they're heavily vascularized suggests that there's some other functions as well. And we saw that there are other groups of dinosaurs that may lack big antorbital fenestrae, like pachycephalosaurs and ankylosaurs. And in these forms, they tend to have other elaborate structures in the nasal region, which may have been used for dumping heat. And here we have an example in the case of hadrosaurids, or Baglambisaurian hadrosaurids. Indeed, that team that's been looking at this vascularization of the head have also noticed in spots that people weren't really looking before, other regions that might be important in heat dumping. For instance, in sauropods, it looks like the inside of the mouth tends to be one that's got a lot of blood vessels in there along the inside. And they may have been using that region to help keep their heads cooler than the outside body. And it's particularly important in sauropods, given they're just so huge, and their brains are so tiny, that they really run the risk of cooking their brain if they can't dump a lot of heat. So here we have a hypothetical reconstruction of the heat pattern thermal image where the head is a lot cooler than the rest of the body. Indeed, one of the reasons for the long necks in sauropods and tails, long necks and tails in sauropods, may have been that they too were in general to help dump heat, although of course they had other functions like feeding high in trees, and in the case of a diplodosid, defending itself with a whip tail. Let's see. And so Porter and Whitmer sort of trying to summarize these studies, have shown that small dinosaurs seem to have less complex structures to dump heat, but at least some, and that various groups, as they get larger, show convergently the development of different sets of adaptations, often associated with the nasal region in one form or another, but not exclusively, to help get rid of heat. And so it seems to be the concern. It's not so much trapping heat in the body for a large dinosaur, but rather managing it and getting rid of it. Now, going back to the last century, one of the things that came out of the studies of dinosaur physiology was that the idea of warm-blooded versus cold-blooded in the modern world is a false dichotomy. Animals do not neatly split into warm-blooded and cold-blooded animals the way I implied in the first lecture on this series. It's not just fish, reptiles, and amphibians cold, birds and mammals warm. For instance, as I showed actually, I did show on that one platogram, tunas, at least some tunas, the billfish are things like marlin, swordfish, sailfish, and some of the sharks all have warm-bloodedness to one degree or another. They are endothermic. So there are warm-blooded fish. There are other warm-blooded fish too. Incidentally, anyone notice anything similar, if you know about the ecologies of these? But lambda-form sharks, sharky sharks. When they have Shark Week, these are the sharks they show on. They don't show you nurse sharks. They don't show you dogfish. They show you big open sea pelagic predators. Anyone notice anything similar about these three groups ecologically? Yeah, and Beck.
Body shape, they're all like fast, active predators.
They're all fast, active predators. Absolutely. Is that what you were going to say? Yeah. These are all pelagic hunters, fast-moving, swimming predators. Their cousins in each of these groups do not show this. So this is convergent between these three different groups. In fact, it's definitely convergent given that tunas and billfish are more closely related to you and me and dinosaurs than they are to sharks. In sharks, the cartilaginous fish branched off before all bony vertebrates. The reason I brought that up is keep that in mind, because that's going to be important next Monday, so next lecture. The idea of pelagic, fast-moving pelagic, that is open sea hunters, evolving warm-bloodedness. We're going to see that happened in the Mesozoic as well. Also pythonids, pythons, or at least some pythons, which are some of the few groups of snakes that have parental care of at least the eggs, not the babies, but the eggs. They actually surround their eggs, they brood their nest, and they generate heat to keep them warm. So in that sense, that's similar to what we see in some of the terrestrial warm-blooded animals. Remember, both mammals and birds are unusual as amniotes go because they have parental care of the young and indeed either brood them or maintain the young inside the body. And there are even warm-blooded plants. Okay, technically they're not warm-blooded because they're plants, they don't know blood. But there are endothermic or even technically exothermic heat-projecting plants. These include some of the water lilies and also the eriods, which are a group that includes this one, the corpse flower, and in this region of the world, the skunk cabbage. Now, in the case of most of these plants, the reason for their heat generation is as a molecule gets hotter, by definition, it has higher energy, that's what heat is, and it can travel further. And so most of these plants, what they do is when they're in blossom, when they're in bloom, they generate heat, and it makes the particles of scent from them travel farther. And that has a selective advantage, because that means they're broadcasting the fact that they can be pollinated, or that rather, they're broadcasting the signal that they have nectar further, and that attracts more insects, which then fly down there, suck on the nectar and get pollen all over them and help pollinate them. So it increases their ability to propagate, to pollinate. And what they do is they have a store of energy that they've built up over the previous year, or longer in the case of some of those plants, and then they basically burn that off to get that energy. Now the skunk cabbage, the local representative of one of these groups, has another advantage that it does with this. It doesn't necessarily do it during blossoming time, although they do, but they also use it at the very beginning of spring. Skunk cabbage is one of the first plants to blossom in the temperate zone. And the reason it can do that is it actually warms the soil around it. So if there's been a hard frost during the winter, they've warmed up the soil and they can spread their little roots in it and they can come out and start capturing sunlight sooner than other plants. And that's the resource many plants fight over, is sunlight. As an aside, corpse flower, skunk cabbage. As the names imply there, they are not nicely fragrant in ways that we like. And that's because they're both pollinated by flies. So the smell of a plant, a smell of a bloom, will tell you something about who's pollinating it. Those that get pollinated by the wasp group, so wasps and bees, or those that get pollinated by butterflies, they smell sweet. They're sugary. They actually smell nice to us. And that makes sense because our ancestry as primates were fruit-eating, among other things, animals. And so we like that smell. But those that get pollinated by flies smell like crap, literally, or corpses, or other things that are smelled very unpleasant to us, because flies are attracted to those smells. That's just an aside. Now, as time has gone by, starting with that recognition that it's not just one or the other, people have begun to notice that the diversity of thermal metabolisms are quite broad among animals. So, I already mentioned down here, the pythons, they show braiding metabolism and ectothermy while almost most of the time, but they burn off their body fat during brooding and become, at least for short periods of time, tachymetabolic and endotherms. Similarly, some sharks, which are normally cruising and burning off energy at metabolic rates, switch over to become tachymetabolic. And they do that during a feeding frenzy because that's a time that they can acquire a lot of resources. So they can spend a little extra to turbocharge themselves in order to get a lot more food. So they're what we say heterometabolic or behaviorally heterometabolic. And all of these collectively are under the category of heterothermy, so multiple forms of heat generation. And it's not just typically cold-blooded animals that are heterotherms on occasion. It turns out some mammals, in fact, multiple branches of Mammalia, and for that matter, even some birds, which are typically, we think, there are homeothermic and tachymetabolic. Some of these undergo poikilothermy and bradymetabolism during torpor or hibernation. So torpor and hibernation is sort of the distinction there, sort of the duration. Torpor can be daily or maybe for several days, something. Hibernation is a longer sort of seasonal event. And so here we see the temperature profiles with the ambient, so the outside temperature shown as the solid line, and the body temperature shown as the gray field. And so here we see two different cases of it. These are the body temperatures of a particular species of tenrec. Tenrecs are a group of superficially hedgehog-looking, although not closely related to them, animals, mammals, that are warm-blooded most of the time, but during the seasons that they undergo torpor, this is the body profile, the body temperature profile of a poikilotherm. They are poikilothermic mammals. So it's not mammals are all homeotherms. They're not. They're homeotherms some of the time, but in some seasons they're poikilotherms. And so in an effort to try to understand fossil metabolisms, or metabolic rates of fossil organisms, some people, and here's a recent introduction of the term, although the term had actually been introduced before for a slightly different thing, suggest there was something intermediate, that dinosaurs were something intermediate, so that they were mesothermic. The idea, it was portrayed in the press releases of it, as they're suggesting dinosaurs weren't warm-blooded, they weren't cold-blooded, they were something in between. And so they call that mesothermy. But when you actually read the paper, and I'll say it's not even in the printed part of the paper, it's in the supplementary material online. So if you ever are writing professional papers, if you have something key, like a new definition, you put it in the actual body. Don't put it in the hidden stuff. When you read it, they define mesothermy as the ability to generate internal heat. By definition, that's endothermy. That's not in between ectothermy, and that is by definition endothermy, the ability to generate internal heat. But their distinction is that they're only poorly capable of regulating temperature. And therefore, what they're talking about with mesothermy is actually not something intermediate between endothermy and ectothermy, but sort of something intermediate between homeothermy, with a stable body temperature, and poikilothermy, where you trace the outside temperature. And they talk about some modern animals, like some of those sharks and various other organisms, which they consider modern mesotherms. It was an interesting thought. But is it a thing? So the data that they used had to do with taking some of the growth rate estimates that we saw on the sort of ontogeny of dinosaurs from before, and going through some mathematical approximations to figure out what the metabolic rate was for those organisms at the time they were growing. Now, it turns out that other researchers looking at that data challenged their estimations, and they think they were way underestimating the actual experienced growth rates when they pointed out their values here. So here we see the various values. And even here, you see that Apatosaurus at the 16 grams to the 4th day per day. That's sort of in the range, very close to the range of a placental mammal. But nevertheless, other researchers have said that these values aren't the actual metabolic rate of the organisms. And I've shown you other plots that have shown metabolic rates based on like bone growth, apposition, and so forth that put dinosaurs much higher. So is it really a thing? Well, there do seem to be some animals today, including some mammals. These are monotremes there, but there are actually placental mammals and marsupials that show very low rates of growth. And that actually do seem to be something intermediate in a sense, something where they are at least heterotherms, so maybe we can call those mesotherms. And so we've got things like, here's an echidna, that's a monotreme, an modern egg-laying mammal. Here's a tenrec. And these do have lower overall body temperatures. They typically have torpor. And even when they're in torpor, they're actually capable of poikilothermy. So there are some definite mesotherms out there, if you want to say something intermediate. And they are within mammals, within a group of endotherms, so typically within endotherms. And even when you look at modern endothermic mammals, they're not all the same. Something like a cheetah or a pronghorn is operating at a really high rate. Very tachymetabolic, actually have higher body temperatures than typical other animals. I should put it, rabbits are up on that level too. And that carnivorous mammals sort of span the spectrum in here, and other groups like primates are sort of medium level and so forth. And in these animals, the body temperature is higher. Torpor is rare, although some might hibernate. Certainly, within bears hibernating, but typically we don't see torpor among these endothermic mammals. That is something on a daily basis. And poikilothermy does seem to be absent, that they maintain a relatively stable body temperature. And so if we compare the typical endothermic mammals with these so-called mesothermic, or these heterothermic mammals, what do we see? Well, we see the mesotherms typically are small. They're typically less than 10 kilograms, so less than 22 pounds. They tend to be insectivores or seed eaters, granivores. They are almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them have very short limbs compared to body size, are definitely not cursorial animals, and as I mentioned, they typically have torpor. In contrast, the size distribution of endotherms among mammals runs from things like sengis, which people used to call elephant shrews, and even some smaller, even shrews and so forth, which are very small animals, all the way up to the biggest mammals. They include all sorts of diets, including most of the leaf eaters and most of the flesh eaters. Because the endothermic mammals are such a broad spectrum, some are short-legged animals, but additionally it includes all the cursorial mammals. The carnivorans, the ungulates, the hoofed mammals, and so forth are all in this endothermic category. We don't see them mesothermic. And torpor tends to be very rare among endothermic mammals. So if we look back at the attributes of dinosaurs, which of these two do they compare to in each of these? Well, dinosaurs obviously include many big forms, so in that context they're not like mesotherms or like endotherms. They tended to have had mostly a leaf or meat diet, although there were other forms as well, but that's something that's more like endotherms. They're not like the stricter diets of mesotherms. Dinosaurs are characterized by very large hip muscles and striding locomotion. That's much more like an endotherm than a mesotherm. There are no dinosaurs that have limb proportions like a mesothermic mammal. And we can't really tell if dinosaurs had torpor or not, but one could imagine large-bodied animals are very unlikely to undergo torpor. That's a situation that is very, very, very dangerous because you can't hide. If you're out there in the size of a sauropod, you can't spend long periods of time where you are totally inactive because then you're lunch. And so basically, in all these categories, dinosaurs do not resemble modern endothermic terrestrial organisms. Oh, so they don't resemble mesothermic, they do resemble endothermic ones. Now we know Aves is warm-blooded. And the question arises, when in the history did endothermy, as found in birds, evolve? Was it after, was it at the ancestral, the common ancestor of all living birds? Was it when avialae split from other theropods? Was it within theropods? Was it within saurischians? Was it within dinosaurs? Or was it even earlier? And one group that we now have to bring in, although we'll talk about it a lot more in detail on next Monday, are the pterosaurs. Remember, Pterosauria is the sister group to dinosauromorphs within Ornithodyra, and pterosaurs are powered flyers whose bone histology shows comparable levels of high metabolic rates to dinosaurs, including birds, and for whom, as we'll talk about on Monday, have fuzzy integument. They're furry. So, high growth rates, evidence of high metabolic rate, fuzzy body covering. And they're the sister group to dinosauromorphs. So these guys are fuzzy. We don't know what the integument of any of these guys looks like. And as I talked about when we talked about the origin of Dinosauria, at least some models suggest that fuzziness might be ancestral for Dinosauria, since both ornithischians and some theropods show it. With all these other question marks in between, was fuzziness not a dinosaurian character, but an ornithodyran character? Does fuzziness go down to the base of Ornithodyra? And indeed, some models show that that's the more likely situation. Okay, now there have been a number of researchers, including, I didn't put down the reference here, a number of researchers who have pointed out that the switch over to endothermy may involve, at least for terrestrial organisms, may involve miniaturization, because the two cases where it absolutely happened and was widespread, mammals and birds, we do know that the first mammals were much smaller than their immediate outgroups. And avialae, or at least maybe Ornithothoraces, go a little one step above that, were much smaller than their outgroups. So here, these are the length of the mandible These are derived but non-mammalian therapsids. These are true mammals, and these are sort of close to mammals, and you see the great size decrease between these guys and these guys. And here, this is Anchiornis, so, a basal avialian and a basal ornithotheracine Protopteryx. So an early Anchiornithine shown basically to scale. So there's a size decrease there. And so maybe people have argued that size reduction is a key factor to the switchover to full endothermy from something that wasn't necessarily cold-blooded, but wasn't the same level. And in a recent paper, here's the author of the paper, there was a look, and there's a set of biologists and biophysiologists and so forth who look basically at models of cost-benefit analyses. And they showed through their math that reduction in body size makes the switchover to full endothermy a lot easier. That you get more benefit out of it relative to the costs you have to put into it if the switchover occurs at small body size. And so it's more likely to switch over from ectothermy to endothermy, or maybe something that's more likely from a moderate level of endothermy to full endothermy, so full level that we see in the derived mammals or modern birds, occurring at small body size. And so that they argued is, you see this reduction in body size in the history of birds from, earlier Eumaniraptorans and Pentaraptorans. Ornithotheracines and modern birds are much smaller compared to them, and those are much smaller compared to earlier centenarian theropods. And so they suggest that this miniaturization event is after the origin of avialae. But are they looking at the right miniaturization event? Because this is not the only time that size was greatly reduced in the lineage leading to birds. Because when we go back and we think about what we looked at in the Triassic, Ornithodira, the first ornithodirians, the members of the Pterosauromorpha and Dinosauromorpha, were tiny compared to their outgroups. And consider, in both groups, we see fuzz. In both groups, we see haversion bone. We see increased levels of locomotion. We see derived forms of respiration, including air sac respiration. We have definite parasagittal stance in all those forms. The calculations of bone growth rate suggest both these groups have high levels of bone growth rate compared to their outgroups. And so I would say, and I'm not alone in this, the authors are correct that the switchover to really high metabolic rates did occur with miniaturization in avian history, but it's not in avialae. It's the first miniaturization event. It's the birth of Ornithodira. The dinosaur pterosaur clade. Now, there's an additional complication which I have alluded to a couple times. And that is, when we look at modern animals, we note that crocodilians are fully cold-blooded animals. And so the default, and it was a reasonable default for a long time, is to assume that they were primarily ectothermic. That is, they were ectotherms because they were the descendants of ectotherms. But in this last 20 years or so, a lot of evidence has suggested, no, that's wrong. That crocodiles are the descendants of warm-blooded animals. And there's a number of both fossil and modern aspects that suggest that this might be true. For one thing, when we look at the outgroups, the fossil outgroups to modern-style crocodilians, we see forms like little Pseudohesperosuchus, which is about the size of a fox. It's a long-legged cursorial animal. Some of these forms have bone growth rates that suggest very high levels very high metabolic rates. Their immediate outgroups from this group are larger forms, but forms with long pubes and ischia that show bone texture for at least fairly high, not as high as Pseudohespersuchus or Ornithodyrans, but relatively high bone growth rates, very high metabolic rates, and so forth. So we look at the bone texture, Pseudosuchia ancestrally, and indeed many members of this larger clade, Archosauriformes, show moderate bone growth texture, whereas Ornithodyrans show the fast bone growth texture. For that matter, remember back at Bacher's predator-prey ratios, when he looked at the Triassic, the time when the Pseudosuchians and some of these other groups, like these guys, were the top predators. They showed not mammal dinosaur really low levels of predator-prey ratios, but they didn't show the ancestral high predator-prey ratios. They showed something in between. So if we want to see something that's maybe quote-unquote mesothermic, something that has a higher metabolic rate than a cold-blooded animal, but not to the level of modern mammals and birds, dinosaurs may not be where to look. It may be in Pseudosuchians and other Archosauriforms is where we look. And indeed, in this model, they found that some of the close relatives of crocodilians showed comparable resting metabolic rates to modern mammals. And that modern crocodilians show a reversal of that. Now, why would that be? Well, modern crocodilians have a very different mode of life. Oh, here's another set of studies that show this. So we see, so modern crocodiles, we can see crocodiles and caiman. Those are modern crocodiles, and these are some of their extinct relatives. In blue, that also show the cooler rates, but that outgroups show higher rates. Modern crocodilians do not live the way ancestral crocodile relatives did. It is a myth to say that crocodilians are unchanged since before the age of dinosaurs. That's just a big-ass lie. The modern crocodilian mode of life, that is a sit-and-wait ambush predator, occurred sometime in the Cretaceous. Their ancestors tended to be terrestrial. Some of them actually were marine, as we'll see on Monday. But most of them were terrestrial. There were striding predators. There were vegetarians. There's little fox-like running forms and so forth. And it's in the derived forms of crocodilians where they take up a new mode of life, where you're sitting in a thermally insulated environment, that's water, and you're waiting for the prey to come to you rather than you stalking out the prey. A situation where reducing your metabolic rate might be useful because you're not striding over the landscape. And so if you're not burning off lots of energy all the time, you can do that more efficiently. And remember, crocodilians are the one group that show this heart that can switch from a 4-chambered heart to basically a 2-chambered heart where the blood's not pumping to the lungs at all. And so crocodilians may have been misleading us. So here's modern crocodilians and some of their outgroups. So the ones in blue are the ones which are most likely cold-blooded based on a number of traits, and their ancestors which show a higher metabolic rate. And so that the ancestral Archosauriforms may have had some level of elevation of metabolic rate, and that it's after the line going to modern crocs split off from some of their earlier precursors that they may have slowed things down because they've taken up a new mode of life. It's worth noting that if you look at the metabolic rates of things like sea cows, which granted are not predators, they're herbivores, but they have a rather slow-paced mode of life. They have lower metabolic rates than their terrestrial cousins like aardvarks and elephants. Now, there's at least some recent evidence that suggests that the environmental tolerances of Pseudosuchians, even in the Triassic, may have been, late Triassic, may have been less high than those of Ornithodyrans and the proto-mammal Therapsids. So this is looking at sort of mean annual temperature is over here, mean annual precipitation. This is variation in temperature, variation in precipitation. And we see that Pseudosuchians tend to concentrate in certain types of stable, so not a lot of variation down here, and warmish temperatures, and sort of mid-range precipitation, but relatively stable. that ornithodyrans, so the dinosaur pterosaur clade, have broad tolerances of all of these. That therapsids also tend to have a broad tolerance of all of these, although maybe even tolerating even more variation than the dinosaurs. And as a test case, the temnospondyls, the big amphibians, show things that are relatively similar to the Pseudotsuchian pattern. And temnospondyls, no one's made any case for them being anything other than cold-blooded. So what do we see in terms of the picture overall? Well, overall, looks like moderate levels of endothermy at the base of Archosauriformes. So at this point, we might presume parental care, because we do have parental care at least at least at this node, so it's not terribly crazy, although it is a level of inference to bring it down here. And we see the change in bone texture to that moderate rate of growth. That crocodilians become secondarily cool. So they have a cool down, but that is a derived condition. That at the base of Ornithodyra, we increase levels of endothermy at this point in miniaturization. So we start to see fuzz, we see herversion bone, so that really specialized bone texture, and increased forms of locomotion and respiration. But that at different points, independently within Ornithodyra, say in Pterosauria proper, in some derived ornithischians, like ceratopsids and hadrosaurids, and some derived theropods, and I don't show here, probably in some groups of sauropods, we get increases in metabolic rates. New types of derived feeding adaptations, like, say, dental batteries, new forms of derived respiration, so the full-on air sac mode in derived theropods, derived sauropods, increased locomotory specialization. So just like we see in mammals today, although all mammals are warm-blooded to some degree, not everything is equally warm-blooded. The same may have been the case with Dinosaurian. On the other hand, is there anything alive today that might tell us how you might have gone from a fully cold-blooded animal towards here? And we do have something that looks like it might be a proto-endotherm. It isn't to the level of Archosauriforms. They don't show the bone texture for that or anything. But when we look at Varanids, monitor lizards, they may be our living model for creatures on the cusp of being selected for higher metabolic rates. They're not there yet. They're still cold-blooded. But they show increased feeding specializations and increasing locomotory ability. They have larger foraging ranges than any other lizard. There's Komodo dragons, the largest living varanids. They have that throat breathing that I talked about, the throat pump, so they can actually oxygenate their body better while moving than a typical lizard. But they don't show parental care of the young. In fact, in the case of the Komodo dragon, the primary predator of baby Komodo dragons are adult Komodo dragons. And they don't show any specialized insulation. They're just as scaly as any other typical lizard. So they might be a hint at what maybe during the history of synapsids, before we started to increase metabolic rate, and maybe in the ancestry of Archosauriforms, of what the animals were like when they began to select for higher metabolic rate. And maybe it was, in fact, things like parental care of the young that might have pushed them over, given how common parental care of the young is among living warm-blooded animals, and at least some fossil ones. And as we'll talk about on Monday, I'm not saying that, actually it might be next Wednesday, there's at least one group closely related to the Varanids in the fossil record that looked like it pushed over. And there is one big modern lizard, one of the tegus, which actually looks like it may have gone over to being fully or mostly warm-blooded, and they have parental care of the young. So where are we at in terms of the thermal physiology for non-avian dinosaurs? Well, broad environmental distribution, powerful striding hind limbs, which we saw cannot be powered at ectothermic levels. Specialized heat dissipating mechanism, which are most prevalent in large body size. Specialized insulatory structures, which are most prevalent at small body size. Specialized food processing adaptations. Specialized respiratory adaptations. Bone histology, so bone texture and apposition rate, rate of growth of bone, consistent with rapid growth. Evidence for some extended parental care. Isotope data showing body temperatures independent of the environment. Low predator-prey ratios in their faunas. And every one of these things is something that's consistent, not merely with something maybe slightly above a ectothermic level, but actual endothermy. And quite frankly, there's really no substantial support for anything but endothermy in Dinosauria. And there has been a tradition since the days of Bakker for paleontologists, many paleontologists sort of reject and sort of hem and haw and say maybe dinosaurs were intermediate and not warm-blooded. And as some recent, reviews of this have gone, that may be as much to do with people not being happy with Bakker, thinking that, they didn't like him personally, as it was about the evidence. The evidence keeps on coming up from different lines of evidence pointing towards endothermy. So it's about time that people just go back and admit Bakker was right. The evidence points to Mesozoic dinosaurs being warm-blooded in the spectrum of endothermic mammals. Sort of the raccoon and elephant to pronghorn level, maybe towards the middle of that, but not down at the tenrec and echidna level. Of course, it might have been easier to be an endotherm in the Mesozoic. And I talked a bit about this before when I talked about the ability to grow large in the Mesozoic. So with different atmospheric compositions, potentially higher oxygen for at least part of it, and higher CO2 levels for most of it, it may have been, and you've seen this slide before, but just to remind you, that there was more food available per bite and possibly more oxygen available with each breath. That it might have just been metabolically easier to get higher energy out of that environment. That the modern world may be more starved. So it wasn't as difficult to get to endothermic levels in the Mesozoic world. So what's the answer? Were dinosaurs warm-blooded or not? Well, all living dinosaurs are unquestionably endothermic. And traits linked to endothermy are present, which can remember the fossil record, are found from, non-avian manuraptorans all the way down to the base of Ornithodira. And at present, there's too much evidence from all those things from what I showed in that slide before for dinosaurs to be good reptiles, standard modern ectotherms. But to be fair, there does seem to be a range of variation of degrees of endothermy within different clades. So hadrosaurids and ceratopsids, as I talked about before, show more adaptations towards higher metabolic rates than typical ornithischians. But that's not unusual. As I said, we see that among Cenozoic mammals. We see that among modern mammals. So they're still warm-blooded, but at varying levels. And there's no evidence that dinosaurs had anything but warm-blooded levels. Okay, so that sort of wraps things up. It takes us a while to get there, but we could see the sort of gist of this. And since we are on the cusp of the one bird-related holiday, that, if you have a good Thanksgiving and if you partake of turkey, you can impress your family by showing, and I've got links to this on the syllabus, you could show different parts of the bird skeleton that reflect different levels of clades within Dinosauria. They're not all at once. So the furcula is present in Neotheropoda. It may go below that, but we can't confirm that, and so forth. So yeah, you could check this out, and you could share it with your family to show that you have learned something in this class about dinosaurs. So when we come back next Monday, we're going to pick up by looking at the other inhabitants of the world of dinosaurs. We're going to start with pterosaurs. We're going to move to marine reptiles, which will probably extend into Wednesday, where we'll pick up our own lineage, the origin of mammals. And then Friday of next week, we begin our look at the end of the age of dinosaurs. So take care and have a good Thanksgiving.